Hi, good day, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to attend our webinar today. My name's Alex. I'm Leaders National Trainer, and I'll be taking you guys through the webinar, specifically focused on the Ubiquiti product and specifically how we handle client steering through the Ubiquiti product. Clients in this instance refers to any type of device, and we'll really flesh out how we can both enable roaming and how we can steer client devices to the best access point possible. So as with any webinar this year, please do feel free to reach out to us if you have any suggestions on future training content. So if you would like us to specifically focus on anything else, you're more than welcome to send that through to us. Very simply, you can just reach us on webinars@leadersystems.com.au, and we'll take that into advisement, and if possible, we'll present that content to you guys. So any questions are most welcome during this webinar as well. Please feel free to post them through the comment section or the question section on GoTo, and we'll answer those questions directly afterwards as well. As with all of Leaders webinars, we do have a prize at the end as well. The only requirement is that you must have attended the event in order to be eligible. So please do stick around for that as well. And again, any questions, most welcome. This one is going to be, I believe, relatively short, so I would appreciate any questions you guys might have. All of the stuff we're seeing today was any snapshots taken or any pictures was taken from a UDM Pro EC, but the settings should be pretty much universal across the different unified controller ranges. With that said, it's very much a technical webinar today, so we're going to delve straight into it, and there's no sales talk, no talk of products. So with that, we can do a quick overview of the objective for today's webinar. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at SSIDs and how they influence client roaming behavior, as well as association and deassociation. We're going to take a look at 802.11 frame types and 802.11 dynamic rate selection. I'm sure I heard a few yawns through the screen at that, but I promise you it's not as boring as it sounds. It's quite interesting to see how that influences your client devices. We're also going to look at minimum rate controls, which I'm sure a lot of you would have seen in the interfaces, and the minimum RSSI values. And then finally, we're going to look at band steering as well. So that's what we want to cover today. And again, if you have any questions or want me to elaborate more on anything, just shout on the comments. So let's start off by taking a look at SSIDs. I think we all pretty much know what a SSID is. SSID is just an abbreviation for Service State Identifier, which is essentially just another way to say it's the name of your wireless LAN. So it's the logical name of your wireless LAN, to be more specific. One thing to recognize here is that most people don't know or understand that you actually get two types of SSIDs. So you get what they call a BSSID and an ESSID. So first one we're going to take a look at is BSSID. So it's the same abbreviation. The only addition to that abbreviation is the B part. So and that is basically, it stands for Basic Service State Identifier. And what that means is it takes the wireless name that you've given, the logical name, and it adds a MAC address to it. So this is primarily done for client steering purposes. So to explain this quickly, if you go to a hotel or any type of retail space or something like that, or even an airport, you'll typically see, let's say for example at Sydney Airport, you'll see that they have a wireless LAN setup, and no matter where you go throughout the entire airport, you'll see the name of the wireless LAN is the same. It is your Sydney Airport Wi-Fi. What the BSSID is responsible for is to allow your client device to make sure it's connecting to the same access point multiple times. So let's say, for example, I had two access points that were at the exact same signal strength to the client device. So let's say this one was at, the one on the right here was at -60, and the one on the left is at -60. How would your client device decide which one of these access points it should be associating to? The way that your your phone will do it, or your laptop or whatever, is it will primarily decide which one to associate to based on the signal strength. But if the signal strength is the same between these two access points, it will pick one, and the purposes of the BSSID is to ensure that it doesn't just hop between the two access points. So in other words, it sends one packet to APA and one packet to APC. So the idea behind a BSSID is so that the client device knows it's speaking to the same access point. So really what they're doing is they're taking the MAC address, they're combining it with the name of the wireless LAN, and it allows your client device to uniquely identify that access point. If you use the Ubiquiti Wi-Fi Man app, you'll also see that if they give you the list of wireless LAN names or SSIDs, you'll see that sometimes you'll find something like, I don't know, guest Wi-Fi. And if you click on that guest Wi-Fi, you'll see there's multiple access points under that list. That's because all of those APs share the same name. And the only way your device can identify or know that there are multiple APs under that same SSID is through its BSSID, so Basic Service Sets Identifier. So that's the way your device can see the multiple access points even though they share the same name. That same name, it's called a ESSID, Extended Service Set Identifier. And what that ESSID is responsible for is it's essentially using the same wireless LAN name across multiple access points. I know some resellers refer to this as meshing. It's not really meshing in the true sense of the term, but what it is, it's just extending the same name to everything. So in this example, they give us, it says the SSID here is Hill 0B, and essentially it's that shared name across all of the access points. That would be your ESSID. And then, of course, your client devices will decide how it associates to these specific SSIDs. So that's one thing that I want to highlight through this training is the vast majority of control happens on your client device. The access point itself typically has very limited control over how a client device associates to it and deassociates to it. If the client device has the correct username and password, or if it's got radius MAC authentication enabled, if it has the correct password, if you're just using standard WPA, then and it knows that SSID name, then it will continue to hop to other access points that share that same username and password, or that same wireless LAN name and password as well. So in other words, if I had two APs right next to each other, one was called Sales Wireless LAN, the other one was called Sales Wireless LAN, and both of them shared the same password, my phone would quite easily jump between the two of them. So the decision when and how to jump between those two access points is purely dictated by your cell phone. So this is a little bit chaotic for planning your wireless LAN though, because how do we steer a device to another access point? We've often seen that devices can get stuck on a specific AP, and that's the main purpose of today, is to avoid sticky clients. So the way that this works, or the way that your device decides to associate to an access point and when to roam, is primarily done through the device's RSSI value. So RSSI indicated here is basically the received signal strength, and that's how well your client device or your cell phone can hear the access point. The stronger the signal is, the more prone your device will be to associate to it. And your device uses this as a primary metric for deciding when it's going to connect to a specific AP. Just a very important note here that an RSSI value is a vendor proprietary value. In other words, Apple would choose to associate to an access point at, let's say, -85, whereas Samsung might choose to associate to an access point only at -80 or -78 or something in those lines. These aren't exact values, just giving you rough estimates. The most important thing here is that the client device decides when to associate and de-associate. And the RSSI value, that signal strength, is not a shared value across vendors. It is specific to each brand. So you'll see sometimes that some brands are more sticky to access points than others. You'll see, for example, Apple devices tend to be quite sticky to a specific access point. It's not because of bad wireless cards or anything like that. It's just purely based on the software that decides when it's going to associate and disassociate to an access point or from an access point. So we'll expand on this in a moment as well. So another part of the SSIDs is the actual mechanisms to wireless is your beacon and probing frames. So the frames that we're talking about here are negotiated between the client device and the access point itself. And important here, there's two types of frames and two types of scanning. So we'll look at scanning first. So very simple concept. You get active scanning and passive scanning. A passive scan would be an access point that intermittently sends out its information to all the client devices around it. So it would passively send out a beacon frame into the air that just announces, hey, I'm an access point. This is my signal strength. These are my security methods. This is the supported data rates that I allow. And it obviously shares around its wireless name and a whole bunch of additional information. You can actually see approximately what is shared if you go look at it on Wireshark and you've captured the actual frame. So the picture on the right here kind of shows what's included with that. So that is a passive beacon frame being generated by the access point into the air. You also get what they call active scanning, which is a probe request sent from your client device. So let's say, for example, your cell phone, you're walking through the city. If you open up your cell phone's wireless tab, you'll see typically it already has a list of wireless LANs that it knows and that it's found around it. The reason it knows that is because it's already picked up a couple of beacon frames from other access points around it, and it stores them for a brief period of time. In active scanning, what your phone does is it will actively send out a probe request to all of the access points around it, asking them to please share back a beacon frame that contains all of this information. So in that, your client device can probe the environment around it and look for access points. The access points are forced to respond to this probe request and reply with the beacon information and just say, I'm an access point, I support these data rates, this is my security method, etc., etc. So the probe request primarily comes from the client device. The beacon frame primarily comes from the access point. The reason why this is important is to understand how we are going to restrict clients from associating to certain access points. So one thing to also note is that beacon frames specifically also periodically inform the neighboring access points. So some of you might have noticed in the Ubiquiti interfaces that if someone sets up an AP and that AP has the same name as your access points, so let's say, for example, it's something like IoT network, which is a very popular name for wireless SSID. If someone sets up an access point right next to your Ubiquiti that shares the same name, Ubiquiti will pick up that beacon frame, the access point will hear it, and it will actually warn you in the interface that someone has got an AP on the same name. And the main purpose of that is to warn you against rogue access points, which is a security risk. So this is the basic frame negotiation that happens between your access point and your client device very frequently. Typically, the passive scanning might be every couple of seconds. As soon as you click on active scanning, that's typically when you click on the Wi-Fi button on your cell phone, for example, then it sends out that probe request to everyone and it instantly tries to get responses. You'll also see that the list of wireless SSIDs tends to populate fairly slowly. So you'll see like 2 or 3 of them pop up instantly, and then the rest of them take a little bit of time to come in. That's typically because the access point it might be further away and it's trying to respond as quickly as it receives it. It could also be that the access point is just busy at that time and it can't immediately respond with the information. One thing that is important to note here is one of the included values is the supported rates. So we see on screen here that it says the supported rate is 1, 2, 5.5, 11, 6, etc., etc. So this is the actual supported data rate. So the access point replies and says, I support a minimum data rate of 1 megabit per second, or 11 megabit per second, or 12 megabit per second, or whatever we want. Specifically, if nothing is set up on the AP by default, it will say that no matter what the access, or sorry, no matter what the client device probes at, it will always respond and say, okay, cool, I support 1 megabit per second, and I can associate clients to me. When a client device probes the environment, it will typically probe at the lowest supported data rate because it's the simplest, and it means it gets the most range. And your typical behavior for a client device is to probe at around 1 megabit per second. The problem with this is you end up having a lot of clients at the fringes of your wireless coverage, so really at the edges. And the problem with that is it drags down the efficiency and speed of your entire wireless network if you have clients that are extremely far away. So we want a way to kind of restrict that. And in that is basically where we start using minimum rate controls, which we're going to see in a moment. So the way that your device decides how and when it's going to associate to an access point is primarily dictated by the RSSI values. But an important part to this is the dynamic rate selection. So DRS, or dynamic rate selection, basically the client automatically negotiates for a physical data rate as the signal to noise ratio changes. So complicated sentence, but really easy to understand. Essentially, if a client device gets closer to an access point, I'll see if I can bring up my laser pointer here. Hopefully you guys can see that. So if a client device, let's say my laser pointer is a cell phone, as it gets closer to the access point, it will dynamically negotiate for different data rates. So as it gets to this place, it will go, okay, cool. Based on the received signal strength that I have, I need 6 megabits per second. And as it gets closer to the AP, it will dynamically negotiate for higher rates. So it'll go, okay, I've now gotten much closer to this AP. I should negotiate up to 24 megabit per second. And your phone or your laptop or whatever will dynamically choose between these rates and will constantly try to negotiate for more and more throughput. That's the correct behavior. It should do that. So that's DRS in a really quick nutshell. The most important thing here as well is this DRS selection is a vendor thing again. It's not dictated by Ubiquiti. It's not dictated by anyone specific. The brand that you're using dictates how it's going to do DRS and when it's going to associate and disassociate. The important thing here is this is why we typically end up with sticky clients. Sticky clients are clients that do not roam well. In other words, they get to the fringes of this network, so they might get to the very edge here and decide instead of jumping off of this access point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick on this access point and just stick at 1 megabit per second, which drags down the speed of my entire network. So the important thing here as well to note is these are physical rates. So this is not the real TCP throughput rate. If you did a speed test, even though your cell phone would show it can do 54 megabit per second, you typically only see really about half of that. That's just with the overhead of the data transmission, etc. So half of that throughput is real throughput. But the process of negotiating this is the DRS mechanism, and this again is vendor proprietary, and it decides, your cell phone or your laptop decides when it's going to jump to something else. So moving on from there, we have sticky clients. We know we experience sticky clients in all environments where even though there's a better access point around, the client device might not necessarily jump to the better access point. And we often see a requirement for overlap. So the next couple of slides that I'm going to show you is how we specifically restrict sticky clients and we kind of boot them off our access points to get them onto better APs. So why do we have so much overlap in an environment? Most businesses would have overlap. What I mean by overlap is overlapping area of coverage for your access points. Leaders' offices is an example of this, where we have our leader Wi-Fi. It's got the same SSID throughout the entire building. And we have quite a few access points that directly overlap with each other in terms of their coverage area. They don't overlap with each other in terms of their channels. So as an example, we can say that this one is channel 1, this one is channel 6, and this one is channel 11, just as a way to make sure that the overlap doesn't negatively impact our environment. But overlap is primarily done for roaming purposes. So let's say I had a cell phone that was only connected on the Wi-Fi. It was making a VoIP call. As the cell phone transverses through this environment, it would dynamically pick which access point to negotiate to or to connect to based on its signal strength, so that RSSI value again. What we're trying to achieve through this is to have enough overlap so that there's no dead spots for client device to go out of range of one of these APs. So that's the primary reason we have your overlap areas. If you don't really need roaming in an environment, then it's not such a big consideration, but it is a very common thing that happens in most deployments. So let's see how we eliminate or try to remove your sticky clients. The first mechanism for this, and this is probably your best bet, is the minimum rate control settings on the Ubiquiti interface. So if you search for minimum rate controls in the Ubiquiti interface, it will actually come up and it will look like this. And you have the ability to select your rate controls based on the 2.4 or 5 gigahertz network. And what we can effectively do through this is when that client device, that cell phone or laptop probes, if it probes at 1 megabit per second, instead of our access point replying and saying, yes, I can do 1 megabit per second, dynamic rate selection, or sorry, not dynamic rate selection, minimum data rate controls will dictate, based on the setting that I've set here, that it will respond only at X amount of data rate. So for example here, I've set my 2.4 gigahertz network to 24 megabit per second. If a client device attempts to probe at 1 megabit per second, it will just respond back and say that data rate's not supported. In other words, the client can't associate to it. As the client gets closer and closer and closer, it will try to negotiate a higher and higher data rate until it eventually gets into range of the access point where we can go, okay, the client device has now probed at 24 megabit per second. And because it can support 24 megabit per second, we are going to allow association. So this fundamentally restricts the range of our wireless access point to make sure that client devices can't sit at the edges of our Wi-Fi coverage and consume an unfair amount of time to upload data. And essentially it limits the coverage while your actual wireless LAN SSID is still reachable at a big distance. So one of the cool parts about this as well is we can effectively restrict legacy clients from probing our network. The problem with legacy clients, legacy would be all the way up to about G and even N to some extent, the 802.11 protocol, I mean. The problem with those clients is they would probe your access points and force a response even though they are not intending to associate to it. And your access point ends up wasting a fair amount of airtime to those probe requests. So with minimum rate controls, we can say don't respond to any one of these probe requests, any one of these slow clients. We're only going to support clients that are close to my access point. And this is another good way to kick clients off, because as soon as the client starts moving away, they might start at 54 megabit per second, and as they move further away, they reach a certain point where the access point just goes, okay, we can't work with this negotiated rate anymore, and therefore you must disassociate or associate to something else. This is probably the hardest client kicking method there is, not in terms of setup, but in terms of enforcement. In other words, when it reaches that point, the access point will typically kick that client off. You need to be careful with this as well, because you can potentially kick off clients that you intend to keep. When you're setting your minimum data rates, do this in increments. So typically I would start with just cutting out 1 megabit per second and see which client devices drop off, and then move up and move up and move up until I see the client devices start falling off. So as a good example of this, at my house, what I've done is I've set mine to exactly cut my client devices as soon as I leave through my front door. That means there's much less potential for my neighboring access points and my neighboring client devices to connect to my AP. So it's a good way to boot off weak clients, and it effectively limits our wireless LAN association range while our coverage area still stays the same. So one of the other methods we have for kind of, I wouldn't say kicking, but moving clients on our network is to do band steering. So one of the biggest problems that we experience on even modern devices today is that because the signal strength is inherently stronger on the 2.4 gigahertz network, because it typically propagates further, your cell phone or your client device will typically tend to stick to that network because the signal strength is always higher. Remember, the primary method your device uses to determine which access point to go to is via the RSSID. Oh, sorry, not the RSSID, the RSSI value. So basically, your phone will always see the 2.4 gigahertz network as stronger than the 5 gigahertz network. Band steering is designed specifically to combat this problem. So band steering is what they call a soft steering technique. In other words, the client device ultimately makes the call here. The client device decides when it's going to jump from one access point to another. With band steering, what we can do is we can say that the preference is our 5 gigahertz network because we can get more throughput on the 5 gigahertz network. And to enable this is just a very quick tick button, just click enable. And what this will attempt to do is as soon as the client device reaches a certain signal strength, it will jump from 2.4 gigahertz to 5 gigahertz. The idea behind this is so that your 2.4 gigahertz network doesn't become saturated. And you don't have all of your clients just stuck on the 2.4 gigahertz network, even though they are in close proximity to the AP and could actually get more throughput from the 5 gigahertz network. So the 2 gigahertz or 2.4 gigahertz network is typically preferred by your client devices, and this method attempts to steer the device to the 5 gigahertz. Again, the decision resides with your client device. The access point can only do so much. It can tell it, hey, listen, I want you to go to 5 gigahertz, but it may resist and it may tend to stick to the 2 gigahertz network. In instances like that, it's the client device. There's not really much you can do about it except changing out the client device. As the last slide on this topic, and just as a quick note, minimum RSI values is another method employed in the interfaces and on the access points. And this is another soft kicking mechanism. Essentially, the access point looks at the received signal strength of the client device, and based on the value that you set, it will decide, or it will ask the client device to roam to something else. So in this example, I've set mine to minus 75. In other words, as soon as my cell phone goes to minus 76 or minus 77 signal strength, the access point will send a disassociation request. The client device then decides whether it's going to move to something else or not. It cannot hard kick or force that client off, but it's pretty effective in modern cell phones and modern laptops. The wireless protocol kind of adapted to this. The important thing here is that you have another access point that effectively picks up this client device when it gets booted. Otherwise, the client device will resist. It'll go, there's no other access point close by, so I'm going to stick to the access point I'm on, and the AP may continue to ask that client to get off, but the client device can continue to just stick to it. So the best way to make sure that your clients roam effectively is you can enforce this, but just make sure there's another access point to pick that up. You can cause problems with this as well. You'll typically see a sequence where it's associate, disassociate, associate, disassociate, and that's a good indicator that you've set this too strict. So it's worthwhile having a play with this, as it's a really good client steering technique. So again, client roaming is primarily dictated by the client device, which is why it's so hard to accurately do it on an AP. If you have clients complaining about this, typically the best thing is to tell those clients that they need to swap out their devices, at least for testing purposes, to see what the impact is of that. I've seen a couple questions come through. I'm going to answer them in a second. That pretty much concludes the mechanisms for steering clients. We go into a lot of depth around these topics on our Ubiquiti classes. We do have training throughout the entire country. Some of these dates have already passed, but pretty much any time throughout the year, we have training in pretty much every state as well. So if you want to expand on this, and we really do go into a lot of depth about this, this is about 3 or 4 hours worth of content that we work through. Please do join us in one of our classes. We'd love to see you guys there. And just as a reminder, we do still have other webinars coming up. We're about to refresh our webinar list to include additional technical topics as well. So please feel free to check that out. We also have all of our recordings for our previous webinars. So we've covered a lot of content already. That's available on our YouTube channel, as well as our Leader Academy site. And to get to the site, very simple. It's just leaderacademy.com.au, leader-academy.com.au. We'll quickly do the Q&A, and as soon as that's done, we can jump into the prize draw. So a question here from David. It appears minimum rate control is done on the SSID level. Can override that on a specific AP. So minimum rate controls, no. It's done on an SSID level. There's no way to do it specifically just for one AP, unfortunately. It's typically applied to everything on that same SSID. What we've seen is people will create additional SSIDs to kind of combat this problem. I kind of share your sentiment that it should be possible on a per access point level, but unfortunately it's not possible at the moment. You can do your minimum RSI values, you can do on a per AP level, but unfortunately the minimum rate controls are stuck to that specific SSID. If you guys have any other questions, you're welcome to post them through now. If there's no additional questions, you guys are also welcome to just reach out to me directly afterwards at webinars@leadersystems.com.au, and I'm happy to answer your questions there.